One day in August 2011, an elderly gentleman called Mr. Kuganathan was walking back home. He was walking back home to have dinner with his wife after a long day at work. He was a hard-working, well-respected man who was loved by both his neighbors and colleagues alike. He was a loving husband, a caring father, and a doting grandfather. His only faults were that he was loyal to the newspaper company Udayan, where he served as news editor, and that he had more integrity than to bend down in the face of the numerous threats that came by his way every day, every time someone disagreed with the news being printed. And most recently then, it was the news stories which were blamed for the government party's loss in the elections that had just been held. So that day in August 2011, while walking back home, this innocent man was followed down the road by assailants on motorbikes. They were there with the intent to kill. They began beating him to the bone, mercilessly, with the thick iron rods that they had brought with them. By the time the assailants fled and Mr. Kuganathan was rushed to hospital by colleagues nearby, he was an unconscious crumple of blood and bone with his skull broken in. After remaining in hospital in near-death critical condition for 4 days, he finally gained consciousness again. As cruel as the story seems, this is the unfortunate reality for many journalists in Sri Lanka. Hundreds upon hundreds have stories of threats, injury, and kidnap like this, all because they refuse to retract from what they believe is the truth. Accusations have been made that the perpetrators associated with such attacks are paramilitary, those from the army and associated with the government, because attacks like this usually occur when the official view of pacification in the country post-Civil War is put into question. But I'm no political figure, so it's not my intention to be pointing fingers and placing blame on an organization or person, and our intention here is purely a humanitarian one. So it's really the people being persecuted for saying what they believe, and their families who get caught in the crossfire, they're the ones who matter. I could go on to quote statistics about just how dire the circumstances are in the country, such as Sri Lanka has been ranked by the Committee for the Protection of Journalists as being one of the worst countries where attacks against journalists go unpunished. This has been reiterated by the 2014 World Press Freedom Index, where the country has been ranked a menial 165 out of 180. But I feel with us living in America, where we're not very used to thinking about our freedom of expression and freedom to life very often, because it is comparatively plentifully given to us, it might be hard to comprehend the entire force of suffering that ensues because of the denial of those very rights. So that's why I think the best course of action here is to discuss the human element of this vast and controversial topic, for with that, we can all empathize. My father is the owner of 2 newspapers in Sri Lanka, one of which is called Udayan, is most notorious for being bombed or burned on a regular basis and having its journalists and staff members killed or kidnapped as repercussions of articles published. Since the day the newspaper started, there have been 38 incidents of extreme violence against it, and so far no perpetrators have been properly identified or any action taken in court. The story of Mr. Kuganathan that I spoke of before is just one example in many. Another incident which was regarded by many as the most blatant disrespect for human life and press freedom was when in 2009, 7 assailants, armed with guns and covering their faces with motorbike helmets, raided Udayan. They held the security guards at gunpoint and dispersed into the various sections of the newspaper office, shooting at random and causing as much damage as possible to both people and property. One of the victims that day was found shot dead, still sitting at his table. His name was Bassi, and he was a marketing manager. He was only 36 years old. He He was a father of 2 children, a 3-year-old and a 3-month-old. In the crime scene photos that were taken later on in the day, earlier on in the day, he had left to buy some milk powder for his children because he already finished work. He shouldn't have even been there for the incident. And in the crime scene photos that were taken later, the packet of milk powder was still on his table, only covered in blood. Another who was killed that day was a circulation staff. When the perpetrators had invaded the company, they had made everyone lie down and then started shooting in random directions. One of the people in the circulation staff department was a security guard, and he had been hurt by one of these random bullets, and he had screamed out in pain. And it was as a response to this scream that another staff member called Ranjit had looked up. And that's all he did. He looked up, and he was shot. When he fell down, the perpetrator climbed up on his back and released a few more rounds. Ranjit had just returned back to work that day after a holiday he had taken for his wedding. And that day, on the floor of the circulation department, he died, having lived less than a month with his wife. The reason I feel it necessary to talk about the background of these victims is because it is easy to misunderstand the situation of media freedom in Sri Lanka. These incidents that I'm recalling did not happen in the middle of nowhere in the outskirts. In fact, they happened in the center of one of the very largest towns. And these people that I'm talking about are not larger-than-life war photographers stomping in the middle of mine-filled battlefields. These are very regular people simply trying to speak the truth and earn a living by working in a newspaper. It could happen to any reporter, any staff member of any publication, which did not adhere to the rules of what is considered safe to print. In fact, such incidents have occurred time and again, and perpetrators gone so unpunished that it is becoming expected and even acceptable for journalists to get hurt or go missing because of their opinions. There is almost a they knew what they were getting into attitude building up in the country, and that is what I'm speaking against, because human rights, as we all know, should not be so unashamedly thrown to the wind. And that is why I'm so grateful for Amnesty International focusing some of its work on the journalist Prageet Ignaligoda. Mr. Ignaligoda was one of the Sri Lankan journalists who was kidnapped by the notorious white band. He went missing on 24 January 2010 when he left his office after work. He too is a husband and a father of 2 sons. In her interview to BBC, Mrs. Sandhya, his wife, was quoted saying that the reason her husband went missing was because he was informing diplomats about the Sri Lankan government's usage of chemical weapons against the people in the north during the war. Now, this is a fact the government has always vehemently denied. So once again, this is a matter of a journalist's view, differing from what is officially stated. So once her husband had not come back home that night, even by 9:30 p.m., Mrs. Sandhya knew there was something wrong. Imagine how you would feel if one of your loved ones, your mother or your sister or your father, simply didn't come home one night after what had seemed a perfectly normal start to the day. There was no reason, they just vanished. So many years since Mr. Prageet's disappearance, facts of the case and investigation are still unclear. In November 2011, the then Attorney General appeared before the United Nations Committee Against Torture and said that it was reasonably certain that Mr. Ignaligoda had taken refuge in a foreign country. But when he was summoned in a Sri Lankan court later to testify, he recanted the statement, saying that he wasn't sure if the information that they'd gotten about the journalist was true. While the disappearance is agonizing, more often than not, it's the weight of not knowing what the fate of your loved one is, which is even worse. Yet, since the day of the disappearance, Mrs. Sandhya has been a pillar of strength and perseverance, who even after so many years has not given up the fight to look for her husband. My own uncle, Mr. Vidyadharan, was also taken by the white family. He was editor at my father's newspaper. So I fully understand the mental agony that a family goes through when such an atrocity happens. In my uncle's case, he was dragged into the van while he was attending the funeral of his aunt in front of all his relatives, and despite all their efforts, they couldn't save him that day. But my uncle is one of the more fortunate journalists because we were able to track down his whereabouts within days, and he was released from detainment in 2 months. But we couldn't have achieved that without the work of the international community and their cooperation. That is why the work of Amnesty International and all of us here is so important, because every little bit counts. Whatever we do from wherever in the world does have an impact. So on that note, I end my talk here today with a note of hope. Hope that there will one day be a time in Sri Lanka where every person, journalist or not, can enjoy their fundamental birthrights, including freedom of expression, without fear of retribution. Thank you.